Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I really appreciate your coming out in the middle of summer when everybody else has left. Tonight I wanted to talk about kind of the writing life transnationally because for the last 40 years or so, I've been shuttling between the U.S. and Asia, primarily the Big Apple, New York, and Hong Kong, Bohemia. And so that's why I sort of thought this would be a way to sort of frame what I wanted to present tonight. I'm very glad to hear the Asia Society speak about this incident with Penn, because I am in the Penn anthology also, but I didn't come back in time for their book launch. So I just came back in time to do this. So tonight, what I'd like to do is basically talk about my two most recent books with a little bit more focus probably on the memoir, which is the newer book. Maybe some of you have heard me talk about the previous one, but it's a novel and a memoir. And they're both sort of reflective of my rather transnational life, if you like, because they're both kind of transnational texts. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So I'll start with the novel. So why does anybody even write fiction? Well, I know why I do. I mean, this sounds like this sort of academic sort of statement to examine the world as it is versus the world as it could be. But really, it's so that I can hang out in the world that I live through the characters and through the worlds I create for my books. Now, this particular novel, That Man in Our Lives, which is in the bottom corner there, I was sort of engaged thinking about, guess what, the balance of power between US and China. Because, I mean, what else is there to look at in this day and age if you're living partly in Hong Kong and partly in New York? And what I came across was John Adams' Nixon in China, an opera. I don't know how many of you know it. Anyway, I got really obsessed with this opera because he took this very historic moment of Nixon going to China and turned it into an opera. And I thought, damn, I wish I had done that. But since I can't write opera or even a novel like that, I wanted to do my version of, well, not so much that particular moment in history, but what that moment in history led to for the kind of people in this transnational world that I'm writing about. But the other thing that this novel is also about is, well, you see these three other images. They're my three previous novels to the one from that. And the reason I've put them up there is that the main character of the novel, Gordon Ashbury, who's an American, appeared in all three previous novels. He started as a minor character in the first one, then he became a little bit more, and then he became a little bit more. So it was like, okay, you want your own book? Fine, you got it. So that's kind of what happened. You know, I have other characters in my fiction that repeat like that, but nobody quite like this particular character. So when that happens to you as a fiction writer, you sort of said, he's been following me around the world. I mean, he travels even more than I do. So I'm kind of like, okay, I guess this transnational world is asking me to write this particular character because he says something about what I know of the world. So what I'm going to do, this book has two openings. I'm not going to read you all of it, but it's too long. But what I'll do is read you just like the first page of each of the openings. They're sort of like prologues, if you like. They're both places where you'll get to meet Gordy or Gordon Ashbury. So I'll read you the first opening, which is titled Prelude 2, which is a reference to the jazz standard by Duke Ellington, Prelude to a Kiss. I wonder, okay, I'll read from here. Prelude 2. Let's say it's the 21st century, 2005, or maybe 2006, and we're partaking of tea and sympathy when Bino says, I'm in love with Gordy. What Bino Relugio actually says to me is this, girl, you're too much in love with Gordy. I blanch. There's white somewhere inside all this yellow, this Meyer lemon yellow. We're floating around the vicinity of the Asian American Writers Workshop on West 32nd off 6th in Manhattan's Koreatown. Later, though, alone at the blank page, I can't help thinking perhaps he's right, because Bino doesn't lie or undermine. After all, he and I have not trod the tried and true path, the one that allows us the delusion of having somewhat arrived, the one that makes us think we're headed in the right direction. We're always on the edge of things, silently shrieking, precipice, precipice, as if the edge is edgier, the edge more in tune with souls in doubt. Tottering around memories of Manila and Hong Kong as we dance to the rhythms of margarita and tripe, 2-for-1 martinis, the clubs in Chelsea where the gay world plays, and monstrous sushi in our New York City habitats. When you arrive in America, China becomes merely a thing of the past, a foreign bodily feeling, of the blood and guts and gore of centuries, of peasant heroes you long to revere but cannot because of famine, delusion, and other transgressions, leaving you with only monkey kings and whirling white snakes to worship. Of megacities, Hong Kong, Shanghai, even Guangzhou, that gleam with superior mimicry, slave to all those imperialist fuck-me's that they can't help succumbing to. Even you succumb, which Bino knows, because the gleam of that main river, watch how it swells beyond a stream, is too shiny, too brightly liquid, too irresistible, even for us formerly colonized beings who should know better. So you arrive in America because to arrive is to shed the longing for self in favor of the self America confers, can choose to confer. Okay, well, clearly that opening is a little bit metafictional, which is fiction about the writing of fiction. Those of you who read Chinese might recognize this very famous couplet, which is, I'll give you one of the translations of it. Truth becomes fiction when the fiction's true. Real becomes not real when the unreal's real, which is from The Dream of Red Chambers by Chao Shui-jin, and this is the couplet on the doorway of illusion. When I finished the book, I realized, geez, I guess I was somewhat influenced by Dream of Red Chambers because that, of course, opens as a metafictional novel. There's an opening part with a sentient stone floating around the universe, and that's what it is. So anyway, that's Gordy through the metafictional framework. And I'll now read from the second opening, which is a little bit more like a traditional novel, more like an action narrative. March 2003. The flight delay from JFK into Tokyo meant that Gordon Mark Ashbury, born Gordon Haddon Ashbury, missed his Hong Kong connection and spent the night without luggage at a hotel near Narita, courtesy of Northwest. His travel companion, Larry Wu, was billeted at a different hotel as a result of alphabetical logic. In the morning, Larry Wu boarded Japan Airlines Flight 731 for Hong Kong. He looked out for his longtime friend, the man he met some 40 years earlier on board a flight from Hong Kong when Larry was still an eager foreign student leaving home for the first time for college in New York. As boarding ended, he listened concerned to the announcement that departure would be delayed due to a no-show because that passenger's baggage had to be offloaded. Procedure in the best of times, but post 9/11, the travel world took fewer chances. Larry flagged the purser and suggested the airline page Gordy one last time because his friend must be around. Perhaps he didn't wake up in time, the purser remarked, although she made no attempt either to stop the offload or issue an announcement. Larry sat back, trapped, unable to decide whether or not to disembark. In all the years of their friendship, he had never known Gordy not to wake up, Gordy, the man who never slept. Gordon Ashbury meant to board JL 731. The check-in counter was frantic when he arrived because some dignitary had lost either his passport or wallet, or so Gordy ascertained from the Putonghua conversations among that Chinese party. Japanese agents were bowing. Chinese faces looked perplexed. Sino-Japanese relations were at their usual impasse, their minimally shared language notwithstanding. It was, as Chairman Mao might have said, a moment to be seized. Gordy had been prepared for the past year and a half. In the men's room, he chose a stall at the far end, away from the entrance to delay discovery. There he removed from his calfskin travel wallet the driver's license, social security, and credit cards of one Marshall Hayden, as well as a U.S. passport that listed his occupation as a jazz singer, baritone, with a work visa for Japan. The passport and wallet of Gordon Mark Ashbury he left in the stall. So if you want to find out what happens after that, you have to read the book. But basically, he disappears. It's a mystery that opens the book. And the novel then that follows from this is about after and before he disappears and the impact of that man on the lives of everyone in the book. On some level, the book's really about long-term friendships. You met Larry Wu briefly in there, who's one of his best friends, and the other person you also meet briefly in the introduction is Harold Haight, who was his college roommate at Yale. The thing that's great about a novel, you see all these masks there. Masks are what you put on for your characters, and you get to play with all these characters, and you get to hang out in the world with them to try to understand what's going on. I've often believed that, you talk about a writer's life, but a writer's life is in her books. That's where it is. That's where my life is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Anyway, to just go back to Red Chambers for a minute, one of the hallmarks of that book is how many characters there are in there. Of course, there are the three main characters, which I also have three main characters, but it's this host of other characters. And I've never written a novel. This novel took me 9 years to write. I will never do that again. But it is because I had these two parallel narratives. One was metafictional, and this I character, narrator, meets all the minor characters in the book. And it just appears in interludes, whereas the main story goes on, which is like more similar to this narrative that you just heard. But all those minor characters play a small part. So that man in our lives, well, the hour is also the life of the narrator of the book. Anyway, now, if you were a writer, which window would you rather stare out of? These are actually what I look from my two writing studios. This is what I see. So clearly, that one's Hong Kong. Our building is undergoing sort of reconstruction at the moment. So there's scaffolding, and I'm up on the roof. So from my rooftop window, this is what I see right now. I live a part of my life in New York City, but mostly these days I'm living up north in northern part of New York State. So when I look out of my window, I see this Japanese maple. And this spring it's rained a lot, so we have a gigantic tree at this point in time. So anyway, part of my transnational life has really had a lot to do with the fact that I've been trying to leave Hong Kong as long as I've been around, and I can't seem to. Which brings me to my new book, Dear Hong Kong. I give you a little background on it. This is part of a series. This is what it looks like. It's part of a series of Penguin shorts. So in 2015, they approached me and said, we want to do a series for the 20th anniversary of the handover, which is this year. And they wanted like different writers. So there's one book that has written about Occupy Central or the umbrella movement, another one about the basic law. And they said, and we want like two literary creative writers. So they have Dong Kai-cheung, who's a very well-known Chinese writer, and it's his Cantonese love stories. And then they approached me, and I said, sure, here's some fiction. I gave them some short stories. They said, oh, no, we want you to write a memoir. I don't write memoir. That was my first response. It's like, I've never written a memoir. Why would I write a memoir? And so I finally sort of agreed to write like essays, personal essays, because I do write personal essays. But I've never really thought of my life as something that I wanted to write a memoir about. But my editor was quite insistent, and they kept prodding me towards the memoir. So I finally said, all right, I want to write it as a Dear John letter to Hong Kong. You know, the Chinese salutation of a letter, 親愛的香港, or 親愛的爸爸, or whatever it is you use, the language is actually more intimate than just dear. This Chanoi or Chinai, it has this sense of intimacy, this closeness. So I cast Hong Kong basically as this kind of troublesome lover whom I've been trying to say goodbye to for a very long time. And this does speak to my rather transnational life of trying to leave Hong Kong. So let me introduce it by, why don't I do this? I'll read you first just from the preface of the book, the introductory section. It won't be the whole thing. I'm going to just read you a kind of abridged version. I think it's too long to read the whole thing, but it'll give you a feeling for what the book is about. And it's called In the Time Before. In this time before the yet to come, that Chinese future tense Mei Loi or Zheng Loi, the future moment in question being the year 2046, I have already begun saying goodbye to my city. See, I still call Hong Kong my city, the way Sai Sai once did, this other Hong Kong writer whose pen name tracks closely to my own byline, except that unlike me, she writes in Chinese. I have been occasionally complimented for her work, or been contacted about her books, such as her novel, My City, the one that, of course, I did not write. Hers was a stunning work, something that spoke so well to me of a vision of this city when I was still the fledgling scribe trying to put my HK into words. See, the city has already become my HK, an abbreviation dating back to my birth and childhood here, a residency that carried through to adulthood in a spasmodic fashion. Almost everyone uses initials, followed by a surname, when their Cantonese name is turned upside down into English. There are probably hundreds of H.K. Wongs, Chans, Lees, Max Leungs, and a number are undoubtedly men. H could be the Cantonese Hawk, meaning to study, a good character choice for a name in my education-obsessed city. As for K, take your pick, as so many characters with a K sound denote something masculine, making these all suitable choices for a boy's name in Cantonese. If I seem a little repetitive about Cantonese rather than Chinese, it is because this southern dialect is the real language of my HK, much more so than the two other official ones, English and Putonghua. So my voice is not a vox pop, this English language story I tell, this attempt at remembering my version of the city as a local foreigner. I am a native daughter, born and bred here, a child of overseas Chinese Wagyu immigrants from Indonesia, who happens to be an English language writer of fiction, and who is, for a change, trying to tell some of the facts of her life in a memoir, the way the genre demands. What will happen after 2046? Or more accurately, 2047, the year when something is actually supposed to happen to HK. Once upon a time, we used to say, what will happen after 1997? That was the year of the great handover, when my HK returned like a prodigal child to his real parents, the nation of China, having spent too many adoptive years with his foreign parents, Britain. He was still a young man then, a boy really, just barely out of adolescence. This is the problem of belonging to families that are very, very old, ancient even, with not hundreds but thousands of years of history, because you remain a youth for a very long time. But the problem at hand is 2046. The year 2046 is in fact a highly political future moment, the way 1997 once was. It is a year that colors anything I write about my life in this city, and is a reason I am saying goodbye to my city in the Dear John letter that follows in these pages. A dear HK prolonged goodbye. The year 2046 is when our current life will end. Since I'm writing a memoir in the form of a Dear John letter to say goodbye to HK, mine's not to reason the whys and wherefores, to interpret Article 5 of the Basic Law. Instead, let me think about language, since that is the only tool a writer has, and the latter part of Article 5 that speaks to a 50-year period of frozen time for an unchanged previous capitalist system and way of life. The trouble with a deep freeze is that you have no idea what will happen when you unfreeze, especially after such a prolonged time. As it is, you worry about defrosting the chicken that has sat in your freezer for a month or so, purchased with all good intentions to cook and consume before its use-by date. But somehow chicken never quite appeals to my home cooking taste buds when all the Chinese cuisines available in HK restaurants do a much better job than you can. Future tense is like that. Desire suspended, more imaginary than real. So HK, this love of my life, albeit an oftentimes tiresome and petulant lover, is in semi-suspended animation, with only his head sticking out of the deep freeze, so that he can continue to yell at me about how upset he is. Have you ever been in a relationship with a hopelessly maimed lover? Well, perhaps not maimed, since he willingly placed his otherwise functioning body into this frozen state, leaving only his head at work. All head but no heart does not a lover make. Do you wonder that our relationship has become at least slightly maimed? And so, dear John, let me begin my goodbye. You will scream and rail, of that I have no doubt. But to mitigate your pain, let me recall happier times, or at least past times, when we lived through our previous capitalist system and way of life. Let me recall for you some of what that life has been, was, and still is all about in this, our unchanged moment. Perhaps that will give you some comfort, this serenade to you, HK, O city of my heart. Quizás, quizás, quizás. Okay, so you may recognize the Spanish tag from a well-known pop song. The English version of it is called Perhaps, Perhaps, Perhaps. The book sort of divided, you had that little bit of the preface that you heard, into 7 parts, and it's a sort of parallel chronology. So in trying to think about Hong Kong, in fact, I wrote it between 2015 and it was pretty much done 2016 and into early 2017 when we were editing it. There was a whole lot going on in Hong Kong, and I didn't actually spend all that time here. In fact, I took off a part of it to go to Arizona to spend a semester. I was teaching at a university over there. So I was interested in a lot that was going on in Hong Kong, but it is a short book. So I had to figure out a way to make the story happen. And for me, it was a first, since I've never really written a memoir. So basically what I did was I took only those periods of my life where I lived full-time in Hong Kong. So that's childhood through secondary school, 50s and 60s, and then the mid to late 70s when I had I had gone to America for university, got my BA, and I came back. And then most of the 90s I spent back in Asia, mostly in Hong Kong. I was here for the handover. And then I went back again to the US. And in 2010 to 16, I actually lived here full time as I was at a local university running an MFA in creative writing. And I left as of middle of last year. So I kind of wrote that pass of my book chronologically. And along with it, I was also writing chronologically everything that was happening in the present day in Hong Kong. And of course, I didn't write a lot. I would select certain things that happened in the news, politically, sociologically, whatever, culturally, and those provided entry points. So it was kind of like 2 stories going on that way. So that's sort of how the book happened. And it was kind of interesting because it was, I was sort of living the book as I wrote it in a way that I've never done before. And I suppose that's the difference for nonfiction. There is an appendix, as you see, and that emerged as a result of my writing actually as subtext to the book as I was writing. See, one of the problems when you think about Hong Kong, it's a big international city, it's very well known, but if you, in the literary world, if you sort of go out there and talk about Hong Kong, you still get people who ask you if it's in Japan. So, I mean, I wound up then writing a kind of subtext that was a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I felt there was a lot about Hong Kong in the present day and in the past that needed sort of some explanation. But I didn't use footnotes in the academic sense. In fact, they were very anti-academic footnotes. They were rather tongue-in-cheek. I got a little carried away when I was writing this. I wrote this huge subtext in footnotes, which when I got together with my editor, we finally agreed that we would tamp that down a little bit, and some of the sort of informative material I could put into the appendix. And so that's kind of what happens. That's why there's an appendix there. So I'd like to close by just reading an opening excerpt of the first chapter, which is Dear John, I mean HK, and give you a feel for that. And then, you know, we can talk about the book and I'll answer questions or whatever. That's the view from my roof, actually. I live up on the rooftop, that's why. So I'll just read you a small section of it, just the opening. Dear John, I mean HK. Dear HK, I had not planned on saying goodbye. Not yet. We were going to have many more years together, our love affair peaking and valleying as it does. Oh, I knew I would leave you one day when age caught up to my transnational life, and it would no longer be possible to embrace such an immovably petulant, albeit persistent, lover. But now is too soon, when I am only in my early 60s, and when 60, we hear, is the new 40. The grand departure was meant for the long run, although definitely before 2047, that defining date, that 未來將來 yet to come moment when two systems will somehow be compressed into one, when the mainland of China will actually take hold of your fragrant harbor, those waters between lands and worlds. How do you write a Dear John letter to this most magical harbor in the world? My father never did. In 1949, Dad flew into the city for the first time from Shanghai, having missed the flight that crashed, or so our family law goes. He was studying at St. John's University, where he managed to complete perhaps a semester, perhaps a year. It's never been clear to us exactly how long he spent there, but we know he did have a blast and that he spent some of his time there in winter because he told us often about the icicles hanging outside his window, a sight that fascinated him, this boy from tropical Java. He remained in Hong Kong, carped a lot about the culture and its inhabitants, and died here suddenly one night at home of an aortic aneurysm, silencing his carping about the city's future decline. My father loved that harbor, though, magically echoed in the Platter's rendition of Harbor Lights on an album he spun, and he fired my girlish imagination by naming other harbor cities, especially Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires, neither of which he ever got to see, both of which I still hope to one day see. He used to stand next to me on our top floor veranda in Tsim Sha Tsui late at night as we gazed at our harbor view in silence. Even as a child, I knew how privileged this view was, how special these late nights with Dad were. Those nights when stars were brightly visible, even the Milky Way in our still clear skies. Before he left us, my father was proud of his Chinese city, more marvelous, he said, than even New York or London, where his two eldest daughters used to live. New York, where I, his eldest, still live, except when I don't. My mother will never get to say goodbye to all this. Mum saw the harbor in a dream long before she sailed into Hong Kong, or so she often told us, a little in awe of her own inexplicable mind. She came, she saw, she conquered her chosen home, a problematic new home where she spoke Cantonese atonally, off-key, being tone-deaf, but managed somehow, forcing herself to be understood in her third language at the markets with hawkers of vegetables, meats, live poultry, and seafood, while bargaining with shopkeepers, tailors, jewelers, and watchmakers, or when imploring teachers at her children's local schools to forgive our many trespasses, those red marks in our Chinese subjects, the Chinese she could neither read nor speak well and couldn't teach us unlike mathematics and English. Mom never willingly gave up, though. You can do anything if you try hard enough, was the motto she lived by, sometimes to her detriment. My mother arrived alone in Hong Kong after the war that truncated her Singapore boarding school education, entombing her back home in a central Javanese village under Japanese occupation. She arrived alone with little money, but a grand dream to study medicine and become a doctor. She was accepted to the University of Hong Kong, but alas, never went. Alone and hopeful, but a little too old for dreams, she instead persevered and became a pharmacist, met Dad, and became our mum. Conquered as best she could. In 2017, at the age of 97, she conquered still, physically robust despite all odds. She fell and broke her hip a few years earlier, but recuperated from the operation and remains in good health, even though her memory is long ago gone, gone, gone. This Alzheimer's mind that is far more inexplicable than the one of her youthful prescience. My parents remained faithful lovers of this city, having abandoned both their villages in central Java, the land of their birth. They sometimes contemplated straying to Hawaii, Minnesota, home to Indonesia, Ohio, but in the end they remained, even while exhorting us, my three younger siblings and I, to pack our bags, leave the nest, go west to live our lives out there, elsewhere, anywhere but here. But I returned, mostly because I had to, or felt I had to. HK issued his Aiguo call, the homeland's tug at the patriot's heart, the way China called all overseas Chinese to return prior to the Cultural Revolution, to show how much you love your country in the Great Leap Forward, to rebuild it and to resurrect it to glory. It is the nationalistic certitude that a Chinese is forever a Chinese, no matter how long she is exiled from home. HK issued a similar call, Oi Tsing, love your city, I suppose, because no other city can possibly compare. No other can be your city village, the home village of Li Po's famous poem that every Chinese overseas recites to solve her homesickness. So I returned once, twice, thrice, each time to stay for several years, a conflict of emotions, because I was kicking and screaming all the way until exhausted, if not tamed, a shrew through and through, always complaining. We've had a prolonged and tempestuous affair, this dream harbor and I. At some point, we made a truce when I conceded, okay, you win. I'm sort of still in love with you. What say we make you my second husband, village? No comment, he replied. Can the male of the species be a concubine? So this is the currently personal. I am held captive right now in my harbor city because my mother has not yet died. How's that for an inappropriate thought? But my life has never been about being appropriate, so there's no reason to start now. Can the male of the species be a concubine? Frankly, my dear, this is the political, personal, pragmatic dilemma that still worries my existence as I stroll down Lover's Lane, arm in arm with this no longer fragrant harbor, this love of my life that insistently lingers, crooning, quizás, 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 like Osvaldo Ferrez did in 1947. So anyway, that's a little bit of the book. And before we head into the Q&A, I'll play you a recording of the song composed by Ferrez. He is a Cuban songwriter. This is a 1948 version in both English and Spanish, and it's performed by the singer known as Desi Arnaz. Some of you may remember he was Lucille Ball's husband and her co-star in I Love Lucy, which was very much a part of my childhood. I grew up with I Love Lucy, and I love Lucy and Desi Arnaz. I always thought that they were a great couple. You know, he's a transnational, and Desi Arnaz is not his real name, of course. So his real name, and I'd like to say it, even though my Spanish is terrible because I don't know it, so you've got to forgive my accent here. His real name is Desiderio Alberto Arnaz y de Acha III, and he was from Cuba. So this is quizás, quizás, quizás.
You won't admit you love me, and so how am I ever to know? You always tell me, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. A million times I've asked you, and then I ask you over again. You only answer, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. If you can't make your mind up, we'll never get started. And I don't want to wind up being parted, broken-hearted. So if you really love me, say yes. But if you don't, dear, confess. And please don't tell me, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. Siempre que te pregunto que cuándo, cómo y dónde, tú siempre me respondes, quizás, quizás, quizás. Y así pasan los días y yo desesperado y tú contestando, quizás, quizás, quizás. Estás perdiendo el tiempo pensando, pensando, por lo que más tú quieras. ¿Hasta cuándo? ¿Hasta cuándo? So if you really love me, say yes. But if you don't, dear, confess. And please don't tell me, perhaps, quizás, perhaps.
Yeah, so actually, for anybody who knows Spanish, the Spanish version is the original, and it's different from the English one. The English is actually a separately written version. The English version assumes a kind of love affair that is trying to get started, and it doesn't quite start because there's this perhaps thing going on. But the Spanish version, it's already a couple, and it's this plaintive voice of the lover saying, you know, it's a sort of a desperate voice asking for some certainty about the love. So that's the difference in the two, which seems sort of appropriate for where Hong Kong and China is right now. But anyway, we have about 10 minutes or so, or comments or whatever. Okay.
That was brilliant. I can't wait to read this. If you were to write a memoir about the other part of your life, what song might you choose?
Well, it'd probably be jazz of some kind, but because I lived a very jazz life, my ex-husband was a jazz musician, so much of my American life, and one of the reasons I didn't come back for a long time was I was having too much fun. I was at jazz clubs all the time, you know, he sat in at a lot of clubs and things like that. But it would be difficult because I don't know. My American life appears in my novels. My New York life has appeared in the novels. But it's a complicated relationship. My next book actually, well, not, but the next one's actually a short story collection of Hong Kong stories. But the book after that is a collection of essays called This Fish is Foul, F-O-W-L. And it's the subtitle is Essays of Being. And the first essay in the book is called To Be American, because I have been writing a lot of personal essays over the last few years, reflecting on just who the hell I am, because my identity is a little bit confused, as you can imagine. So I don't know, but probably it would be jazz of some kind. A lot of, in the novel, actually, that has a huge jazz theme running right through it all the way. And in that one, I used a lot of Rodgers and Hart and Duke Ellington. Those were the two I used the most. But they're not necessarily my favorites. I mean, I do like them both a lot, but there are a lot of other music that might make its way in. Maybe Betty Carter. I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
Out of curiosity, who inspired you to I mean, we had Gish Jen here last year, and I asked her the same question. Growing up as a Chinese American, it was when I first read Maxine Hong Kingston, I was like, oh, somebody looked like me writing. And I remember in high school, it was J.D. Salinger's Nice Short Stories. Love J.D. So for you, what were your inspiration in terms of writing? Kind of got you started, because again, writing is not a field that a lot of our parents encourage us to go in. So what is yours?
I started writing really, really young. I loved to read, and when I was a kid, I just started writing stories. I was like maybe 8 or 9. And it just didn't occur to me not to. I read a lot of Enid Blyton. I mean, obviously, this was a children's story. I read the Naughty series, and then later I read the Mallory Towers and St. Clair's and all that. But I think when I was a little bit more cognizant of literature, and of course I read Dickens and Shakespeare and everything that you do in school, and Eliot and all of that. But really, I think as far as novels and books, if I looked through my parents' bookshelf, it was Han Suyin. She was the first one that looked a little bit like me, And I thought, well, okay, that means that somebody like me perhaps could write. I don't know that I consciously thought it at the time, but that's what made me look at that. And I read The World of Susie Wong when I was quite young, but it was just the book that was there. And then later I read things like Noble House and all of that sort of stuff. But then eventually, obviously, it was Maxine Hong Kingston who was really important for me. Her and Doris Lessing, probably. And I guess, I had a lot of early influences in people like Nabokov, Joseph Conrad as well, even Richard Ellis, Invisible Man, books like that. But it's hard to say exactly where it all began, because I just started writing. I think I was... I don't have writer's block very much, because I think I just write. I don't think of it. I don't think it's something I shouldn't do. That's why. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Have you learned something new about yourself, or as a result of writing this book, about yourself, about Hong Kong, and about you and Hong Kong, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because memoir is sort of a self, exploration. The one thing I realized was that I didn't want to write a memoir. And so I wrote it as, I'm this fiction writer writing this memoir. So it has a sort of writerly side to it as a result. And even in what was interesting was, since it's a short book, it's only about 32,000 words or something, I had to select from those periods of my life. And what was fascinating to me was, well, what do I choose to remember and put in print? This is the part that I couldn't predict until I was writing it. And I was sometimes surprised. I thought, well, I know the stories I tell, but the stories I tell orally are not necessarily the ones that I wrote in the book. I was very surprised, like in the 70s periods of the mid-70s, when I first came back to work in Hong Kong after college, I chose to write about sort of like the second job I had, which was a job that I only did for about 7 months, but it was my introduction to what it means to work for a living, a true introduction. It was a small company. It was a very well-run company, a very modest company. Doesn't exist anymore. It's a sort of outdated technology, but it was a fast printing company. But there was something about that job and I worked for much more glamorous sounding companies and things where I could say a lot more interesting sounding things. But it was just the fundamentals of how unprepared you are when you have a college degree and you come out and you think you know so much, and you walk into your first job and you realize all these people that were working with me who didn't have college degrees knew a heck of a lot more about what it meant to work for a living. It was very humbling, that's why I think. And I chose that one to write about because I realized I learned something there. So that was probably more important and interesting. But thank you. Yeah.
I'm going to read the book, so maybe I will find it here. But do you really say goodbye to Hong Kong, or is it a literary device?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it is true that once my mother passes away, probably I won't have a home here anymore because I haven't bothered to own a home here in the last... I used to have homes, but I sold them all. So that seemed a bit of a sign to me because if I didn't keep some kind of home base of my own, I literally live on my mother's rooftop in a UBW, unauthorized building works. I've had a very interesting correspondence with the government for years about it. So I don't know. I was on Phil Whelan's show the other morning, Morning Brew, and he asked me the same question. I said, well, I guess not really, because I'm still here, and in the foreseeable future, I'm coming back and forth. And even if my mother is gone and I don't have a place to live in, you know, it's not that hard to get a service apartment for a month or so if you need to. I've done that even when I was living here, just because my boyfriend partner came to visit and we didn't want to stay in the squat on the rooftop, so we got a flat for a month. So I mean, I don't know, because a lot of my life and my work is tied up with Hong Kong. I write a great deal about it, and even though my writing of late has gone in other directions, it often circles back to here. And Hong Kong, of course, is a great base to go to the rest of Asia. And I do a lot of work in the rest of Asia. So probably not so quickly, unless the government decides I shouldn't be here for some reason. But I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. So.
Hi, I'm actually editor intern at Penguin China, so I already read your book.
Oh, okay.
I really liked it.
Thank you.
I guess my question is just, you talked about your transnational life. So how do you deal with your different identities at different places? Because I'm also going to college in the U.S., so I'm also a little bit confused at this point.
How do you figure that out, right? It has to do with stuff. Where do you put your stuff? What kind of stuff do you have? In the book, I refer to the George Carlin comedy routine on stuff. Maybe some of you know it. It was one of the funniest things I ever heard, and I've always loved it. But I sort of, you know, it's sort of, where do you go back to, and where do you feel comfortable hanging your hat for a little while? So, you know, I've had this long-distance relationship for 20 years with my, I guess, soon-to-be husband. We finally decided maybe we can get married now. I don't know. And I think when we first got together, I was living in Hong Kong and he was in the States, and I was working for the Wall Street Journal at the time. So I used to fly back and forth, and he would... So then eventually I did move in with him, but then I would take off again all the time. But he said, well, at first he was kind of like, he wasn't quite sure this was a relationship, and neither was I, because it seemed sort of odd that we spent most of our time apart. But the point is, where did I consider home base? And it was with him, and at that apartment, which is a tiny, tiny apartment, and we're still in it. And I suppose that's part of it. The identity has to do with where you feel at home. And I felt very at home in New York. I've lived in different parts of America, but I felt most at home in New York. And even New York State feels... I worked for many years in Vermont. Well, it was a low residency program, but I would go to Vermont all the time, which is a beautiful state, and I would always extol its beauties. But I was always very glad to drive across the border back to New York State, because I knew that that was home. So you find your spaces. I found spaces around the world. I can feel more at home in certain places than others, and that kind of helps to define my identity. And some of it has to do with culture, some of it has to do with your actual ethnicity, perhaps, or languages you speak. But Norway, for example, because I decided I was going to research Edvard Munch, don't ask me, I still can't speak Norwegian, but, Norway feels like a place that draws me for some reason. I hope to get back there again. So that's kind of how I've done it. I don't know if it makes any sense, but that's what I do.
Well, I want to thank you, Shishi, for a wonderful program, because I think your life, I can identify with it, having spent 9 years in New York, 11 years in Hong Kong. Yeah. And somebody asked me the question today, where is home? And I said, well, wherever I am right now, and Hong Kong is home. But whenever people ask me, sometimes it's Ohio. It's where I paid the most taxes for 13 years. But I'm so glad you had a chance to be with us, and I look forward to reading the book this summer and introducing it to my book club. And I want to thank you all for being here. And keep it in mind, despite what happened to your mother, that you always have a home here at Asia Society. So we want to, on behalf of Asia Society, I want to give you our catalog, Breathing Space.
Oh, thank you
of the Hong Kong artist, and I, it's going to be on until August 13th. If you have a chance, I think this is a wonderful discussion, and I want to thank you all for being here. We have quite a few of our interns were here tonight as well to be part of the program, and look forward to having you back. We have some great program this summer, but definitely in the fall. Stay tuned. There's going to be some great things coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.